The tourists are mostly gone, and it's cold and lonely out here. But 200 years ago, there were soldiers out there. And I imagine they were cold, homesick, and a little somber. And on Christmas Day, they probably felt a little miserable. We have a small bottle of whiskey with us, and we're gonna take it up to a fort to tell a Restless Viking Christmas story, a dramatic incident that happened over 200 years ago, when soldiers had enough of the bad treatment from their officer, and they awkwardly rose up to defend their humanity. But it didn't work. We're heading up there to Fort Mackinac, a colonial era fort that still stands for tourists today in Michigan. It's the off season and it's cold here. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
But 200 years ago, things got a little exciting out here. We're gonna talk about the Christmas Mutiny of 1829. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
The channel's Restless Viking. Let's go on a walk and talk. From a strictly war standpoint, Fort Mackinac has a pretty mundane history after the War of 1812. It was utilized more as a strategic reserve for troops that weren't needed at the time. But it did serve as a strategic launching point for many expeditions into the Michigan wilderness, the Michigan Territory, and eventually out west, as far west as Astoria on the west coast.
In 1822, Dr. William Beaumont cared for a pistol wound, the pistol wound of Alexis St. Martin. Dr. Beaumont thought this kid was a goner, but he did heal. Well, sort of. The pistol wound left a hole in his stomach. And so Dr. Beaumont took the opportunity to do examinations and studies of the stomach. To this day, Dr. Beaumont is known as the father of gastric physiology.
So the fort was often abandoned during times of war, and it was left in the care of a lonely ordnance sergeant. And during the Civil War, they kept 3 Confederate prisoners here.
The troops at Fort Mackinac became park rangers in 1875 when this fort became our second national park after Yellowstone. In 1895, the park was closed and the state of Michigan took over.
But one of my favorite post-war of 1812 stories is the Christmas Mutiny of 1829. Fort Mackinac was no doubt a lonely, chilly, dark, and miserable assignment. And that's where our story starts, with miserable men on a miserable assignment. Enter Levi Stevens of Company G of the U.S. 5th Infantry. To lighten his somber Christmas mood, he brought whiskey into the fort. And throughout the day, Levi and his comrades partook in drinking alcohol.
It tastes like I licked the old wood floor at Grandma's cottage.
Now, drinking was a problem in the U.S. Army in the 1820s, so much of a problem that it really affected the combat readiness of the troops. But you would think that even a good officer understands that morale of his men is important, and he would have looked the other way maybe on Christmas Day while the troops were drinking. But apparently not Lieutenant Ephraim Kirby Smith. Lieutenant Smith caught wind of this drinking, and he found Private Kirby to be the culprit. Also in the 1820s, the U.S. Army was not quite the professional organization it is today. It had some abusive officers and some pretty terrible punishments. But Lieutenant Smith was apparently in a league of his own. So much so that he would dish out arbitrary punishments with ferocious and angry violence. And the lieutenant was so outraged that he ordered Private Stevens be lashed for his punishment, and that the lieutenant himself would carry out the punishment. Now, any officer that doesn't take care of his men runs a true risk of a demoralized group. But Lieutenant Smith was in for something much more damning. He was approaching the point of no return. And I say this because Private Stevens' fellow soldiers started assembling on the parade ground. Now, they didn't have duty. They weren't called to fall in. They were assembling because apparently they thought they could save Private Stevens from the punishment. And during this assembly, they were assembling with their muskets fixed with bayonets. For those of us that have been in the military, unless we're on deployment, you don't start randomly assembling with your weapons fixed with bayonets. And it's interesting because the notes from the court-martial proceedings said that they assembled in a very orderly fashion. And of course, this aroused Lieutenant Smith, who came out of his quarters to see his men assembling with muskets fixed with bayonets. And he ordered them to stand down, to go back to their barracks, but they didn't. So you give the order to your soldiers as an officer to go ahead and disperse, and they don't. That's a sign of a pretty tense situation and a sign that you're kind of in trouble. So not only do they refuse to disperse, 3 of the men go ahead and charge Lieutenant Smith. He unsheathes his sword, he parries, his sword breaks, he takes off to get another sword. And while he's retrieving his sword, he alerts Lieutenant Lind and Lieutenant Sibley, and he says to get out there, the men are mutinying. And you can imagine Lieutenant Lind and Lieutenant Smith on Christmas Day going, what? He also alerts the captain of the guard, and they go to check it out. Well, Lieutenant Smith doesn't find his sword, and he returns to the assembly, and the men were dispersing by then, but he wasn't having any of it. He wanted people punished. And within a few minutes, he has the attackers arrested, and he brings 3 of them to his own quarters and starts flogging them. Was it a mutiny? Yep, the military thought so. The 7 men who were involved in the mutiny were brought up on charges, and they were sentenced to hard labor. But there is karma and justice, because Smith, for his part, was also brought up on charges, and he was found guilty of, and I quote, illegal, arbitrary, and unmilitary conduct. He was convicted of 6 separate charges for unlawfully flogging soldiers, and Lieutenant Smith was dismissed from the military. Even President Andrew Jackson signed off on his dismissal, and he noted, any officer that inflicts corporal punishment whilst in the heat of passion renders himself doubly obnoxious to the charge of arbitrary conduct. But the story doesn't end there. After Smith's dismissal from the Army, the sentences of the 7 men were remitted, but Smith himself got back into the military 2 years later because of his family and political connections, and he was killed in the Mexican-American War in 1847. Christmas wasn't easy, and sometimes here it was downright miserable for the American soldier. For sure, the men that were here in 1829 had it pretty tough. Peace on earth and goodwill to men. Doesn't happen for everyone. I've spent time on duty in far-off places during Christmas, and I hope that we can remember all of those that can't be with their family or can't celebrate Christmas in the same way. And if we can help them in some way by maybe allowing them to drink a little whiskey on Christmas Day, well, we should. That's kind of what the season's all about. From high up in Fort Mackinac, I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
Thanks for taking this walk and talk with us.